Now we come to what feels like the modern age, 1961, with John F. Kennedy, one half term. While JFK might not have had the godlike aura of Abe Lincoln, he possessed an intelligence and a presence that far outstripped any president since FDR. Unfortunately, he came from a profoundly privileged and unenlightened family, especially his father, Joseph Kennedy. It would take many years, which fate, of course, denied him, to grow out of that mindset. He was just beginning to when fate drastically intervened. In his first 2 years in office, JFK seemed totally blind or unconcerned about the fate of America's black population in the unreformed and unrepentant southern states. Maybe he naively assumed that the recent Supreme Court decision regarding school segregation and Eisenhower's military enforcement of that decision was enough to shake things up in that recalcitrant part of America. It wasn't. Also, since he was the new boy on the power block, JFK was a bit intimidated by and overly deferential to the military establishment. He was convinced by that near cabal that the new socialist government in Cuba, a small island nation, was somehow a dire threat to our nation. This paranoia about communist-style socialism led him to, first of all, put his stamp of approval on the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion of the island, and, secondly, to provoke the Soviets into a very ill-conceived attempt to come to Cuba's defense by providing it with nuclear weapons. The outcome of all this came very close to a nuclear war. If all that wasn't enough, he then allowed himself to be convinced by the Pentagon that the next ominous threat to the United States was a tiny, poor, third world nation in Southeast Asia. This led America into becoming its own worst enemy, sucking it into one of the two longest, most disastrous, costly, and unnecessary wars in its history. Kennedy, I believe, was beginning to finally recognize his weaknesses when he was gunned down. Before he could put that awakening into practice, he became the fourth assassinated president, followed, of course, by Lyndon Johnson in 1963. LBJ had the makings and beginnings of a great president. He was an adroit and adept politician who could bend the legislative branch to his desires, and those desires were all benevolent and constructive. He wanted to clean up and strengthen America's social safety net. And he had the chutzpah to accomplish that goal against all the right-wing resistance. He probably would have succeeded, except for one reason. He failed to learn the lessons which had been administered to JFK. He naively accepted the omniscience and omnipotence of the old military-industrial complex, remember them, which allowed them to lead him into that deadly, wasteful, and unnecessary quagmire in Southeast Asia. We were beginning to get really good at finding quagmires. That blindness led to the eventual abandonment of his very constructive domestic goals, and finally to his disgraceful retreat from the upcoming election. He was followed by another nearly disastrous president, Richard Nixon. In 1969, Richard Nixon served 1 1/3 terms. In spite of Nixon's initial attempt to run a balanced presidency, for example, he launched the Environmental Protection Agency and opened a respectful dialogue with Communist China, and even, believe it or not, flirted, of course, with the idea of a guaranteed minimum income. But his paranoid distrust and fear of anyone who opposed him, does that sound at all familiar, led him to encourage criminal acts by his henchmen to quell that opposition. This was the onset, the true onset of the Republican Party's slide into mafiosa-like tactics. When he was forced from office to avoid impeachment, he was followed by Gerald Ford in 1974. Who? Whom, do you ask? Well, all that can be said about Gerald is that at least he wasn't Edsel, although that might have been an improvement. He served just about one term, 3/4 of a term, and was followed in 1981 by the man I'll label as one of the very most destructive presidents of all time, Ronald Reagan. Reagan, running against Jimmy Carter, who just happened to be one of America's most humble and unblemished presidents, deviously schemed during the 1980 presidential campaign to blemish Carter's image by sabotaging Carter's negotiations with the Iranian fanatics who had been holding hostage for nearly a year the American embassy staff in Tehran. Reagan bribed those terrorists to not release those hostages, at least until after the upcoming election, callously putting the 66 American embassy staff in unnecessary discomfort and danger for many months more. Even more disastrously, Reagan gave to the aspiring Muslim extremists, the Ayatollah and his fanatical followers, who, you remember, had just attacked and captured the American embassy, a blank check and free rein to expel the newly elected Democratic president of Iran. Thus began an ongoing 50-year nightmare for the people of Iran and for us, still continuing today. Once he was in office, Reagan quickly demonstrated his fawning adoration of the wealthy and his desire to keep a tight yoke on the working classes and their pernicious unions. And that led him to, first of all, cripple those unions, beginning with the air traffic controllers, and then, secondly, restructure the federal income tax system to pander to the already too wealthy class. Reagan, of course, has become a Republican icon, followed by George H.W. Bush in 1989. George H.W. Bush, apart from his responsibility in jamming Clarence Thomas onto the Supreme Court, there's not much I can say about this one. Oh, yes, there is his colorful pre-presidential background running the CIA, where he was covertly involved in the assassination of a key witness in the Iran-Contra affair. Oh, yes, he also begat an upcoming president. He was a quiet-spoken but deadly man, and one who really should have had a vasectomy. Bush was followed in 1993 by Bill Clinton, 2 terms. A brilliant mind in an oversized body who worked his way out of poverty to become a bit too infatuated with the elite crowd. Those and his capitulation to the Republican efforts to crush his progressive programs were his weaknesses. George W. Bush. Talk about disasters. And of course, one of our greatest disasters happened right at the beginning of his term, 2001. In the 2000 election versus Al Gore, with the election hanging by a thread, or should I say Chad, W, as he was known popularly, sat by mutely while his party's goons in business suits violently raided Florida election headquarters to block the recounting. a recounting which looked like it just might put Gore in office. This was the true birth of an unbridled, and, as it's turned out over the ensuing decades, Republican gangsterism. Bush was a true spoiled son of the establishment elite. In his first year in office, he quickly displayed a sophomoric ineptitude that led him to ignore warning signs of the first disastrous terror attack on mainland America. And he managed to follow up that failure by, first of all, giving a green light to his neocon handlers to ruthlessly shred the Constitution and to severely reduce the freedom of ordinary citizens. And, secondly, coddling the actual nation involved in the attack, Saudi Arabia. And thirdly, fomenting a disastrous war against a nation uninvolved in the attack, Iraq. And fourthly, inadvertently allowing the real perpetrators of the attack, Al-Qaeda, to escape, while, fifthly, finally opening a misguided 10-year war against a bystander nation, Afghanistan. Afghanistan, of course, had just won its own 10-year war against the Soviet Union. Bush was followed in a time which seemed like the beginning of a new enlightenment in 2009 by Barack Obama. Another brilliant man, but one who unfortunately believed in his, or perhaps anyone's, ability to negotiate with the proto-fascist Republican Party. The Republicans managed to shoot down or dilute every one of his constructive moves. For instance, his highly qualified Supreme Court nominee, who they simply blocked until his term was gone, and his 21st century healthcare plan, which they managed to cripple. And they did everything but put him under house arrest. He was followed by his vice president, Joe Biden, in 2020. A man for history to judge, except to say that Biden has been a man with two TOO flexible principles and not much backbone. Also, an egoist / apologist with an excess of humility over hubris, which is only a slightly less dangerous formula than its opposite. I mentioned Clarence Thomas earlier. Remember him? There's a man who was and is obviously inept, and dangerous. Thomas would have been quite comfortable in the 1850s Supreme Court. He was a disgraceful appointee and yet managed to slide through a Democratic Senate with Biden as the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. As president, Biden tried to emulate domestically LBJ's extraordinary accomplishments in the social area, civic area, but he was just too trusting and too forgiving to be as effective a leader as LBJ. For example, he was willing to shake hands and deal with, as an equal, a Saudi prince who just happened to be a butcher / assassin, and a man who Biden himself had previously condemned. And he did so simply because of our great thirst for their oil. He was also more than willing, at the beginning of his term, to betray thousands of war-weary Afghan civilians and many thousands of American and Allied veterans by abandoning that nation to the defeated Taliban. That betrayal had begun carelessly and callously under his predecessor, Trump. But it was a brainless action that Biden had the power to undo and neglected to do so. And finally, in his closing year as president, his unwillingness to accept his obvious frailty and vulnerability led directly to the most disastrous election in our history. As I hope you now realize, America's bright vision of democracy has been bruised and battered continuously over its fragile existence, too often treating its only legal edifice, the Constitution, as merely a piece of old parchment. And this failing has led us to today's grotesque apparition. Donald Trump, beginning in 2017. I will leave it at this. Of all our presidents who suffered from an imbalance of hubris and humility, we are now witnessing the most malignant manifestation of that condition since our birth as a nation. Well, after hearing this preceding history, you now know that we somehow managed to survive many less blatant examples. But it may take a miracle for our democracy to survive this one. Of all the reprobates the American electorate has honored with the key to the White House, is it really any surprise that it's now handed that key to a convicted felon? America is going through a crisis right now that rivals and perhaps surpasses the Civil War, the Depression, and the threat of nuclear attack. We survived the first two by having two presidents who were luckily up to the challenge. Las Vegas won't give you very good odds on this one. You're now probably more aware of the fact that it has been a minor miracle that our democracy has survived for over 2 centuries. The obstacles to that survival are manifold. One is the sad caliber of candidates for our higher office. Two is the even more sad caliber of the electorate. Do you realize that even in major elections, seldom do more than 1/2 of our citizens eligible to vote bother to do so? And of those who at least make it to the polls, only half, at most, try to realistically grasp the vital issues concerned, and, if necessary, overcome their own ignorance and prejudice. All right, one last vital point. Almost none of us bother to become cognizant and accepting of how the world's most successful nations today have achieved their success. And this is in spite of the fact that we have some very impressive role models to emulate. Canada, New Zealand, all of Scandinavia. Only half of our fellow citizens can even find those places on the globe. I hope with all my heart that America can somehow find the strength, courage, and awareness to somehow get back on the right track. This is Gene Stroll, thanking you for listening. That is the conclusion of our Rose Gallery of America's Presidents.